I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. Today, a deep dive into the challenges of parenting, religious polarization, and living with deep integrity with thought leader Michael Dowd. All right. I am thrilled to be in this particular episode of not only the Poetry of Predicament podcast, but the Take My Hand Conscious Parenting in Times of Collapse and Predicament, or in the Time of Stolen Dreams. And I'm told by today's guest that that latter one might not be quite on track. So I'll do some reconsidering, and I appreciate that. He would know. This is a man who has provided an extraordinary amount of information, artfully brought forth either original content that he has created or his, again, artful presentation of so many other authors, thought leaders in our times. And Michael Dowd, you were, as I've mentioned to you in past interviews, your original summit of the future is calling.
The future is calling us to greatness.
To greatness, thank you. It was about 5 years ago, and I had never seen a conglomeration of thought leaders of that scale, that quality put together. And particularly on this topic, the topic of what at that time was the immense, obvious strain that humanity was putting on every conceivable life system. And your seeing of that, your obvious and persistent engagement with activism and bridging the faith and secular communities, and your extraordinary thought leadership in that dimension. You brought together all those thought leaders. It was an inspiration to me, not only for that content, but that sort of summit online was possible. So it really shifted me in the middle of my researching and writing of my own book about the topic. And it just keeps coming. Every year you keep coming out with more and more relevant and piercingly important content, whether it's an online learning series or it's webinars or it's your relaying of whether it's books or articles and your own interviews with people. It's just nonstop. And I'm so thankful that you and Connie are that active in that way. And I just wanted to be sure to start with my acknowledgement of the tremendous difference the two of you make in what you do.
Wow. Well, you are so consistent, brother. I feel seen by you, and have felt seen by you in some really, really deep ways, far deeper than most people get me or get what Connie and I are about. And I'm hugely grateful for that and for your work and your leadership in this field. So the respect and admiration goes both ways, and glad to have this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. And I didn't know until just recently that you are a parent, and I just couldn't wait to get you on the roster for this Take My Hand series. Because really, what I keep seeing in so many of these impossible conversations that I have. And I just keep throwing around that term because that's the name of my book from a couple of years ago. And so many of these impossible conversations are with parents who are an order of magnitude, often an order of magnitude more lonely than the average person who has crossed the threshold to be seeing the world as in the midst of immense episodes of collapse of Earth and human systems. But to be a parent with that framing, with that point of view, often means that you just don't get to have conversations with other adults, much less children, about what's going on in this world and how will we possibly hold this, and then how on earth do I communicate this to my children? So I think you're uniquely equipped to engage in this conversation and to share, the many, many communities that you touch in with every year in your nomadic lifestyle, and your immense commitment to that sober, clear, and yet heartful and still deeply inspiring way of seeing this future. So, Michael, welcome to this conversation. And I would just invite you, there are ways that I can start this up. And if you'd like, I'm happy to run through some of the questions that I often start here. But I'm just curious, is there any place you would like to start as we break into this conversation about conscious parenting in these times?
So, yeah, thanks for that question, because it allows me to follow my heart and go where I don't know. We're just going to follow the spirit here, where life leads me. So I'm a parent. I am 61 years old. I have 3 children with my first wife, Allison Renee. She and I were married from 1982 to 1995. We have a now 36-year-old daughter, a 34-year-old son, and a 29-year-old daughter. And in addition to my 3 children and us trying to raise them as consciously and as with as deep an ecological and evolutionary worldview as we were capable of offering, and providing resources for them to deepen themselves, I also have a granddaughter who will be 9 in a few days. She's the daughter of my oldest daughter, my daughter Sheena, living in Texas. And then my youngest daughter, Miriam, let me know about 6 weeks ago that she is pregnant and is due to give birth on May 22nd of 2020. And so this conversation of conscious parenting in a time of collapsed dreams, stolen dreams, collapse and predicament, however you want to, speak about it ultimately, is one that's really near and dear to me, because parents innately are committed beyond consciousness, beyond conscious parenting. Their unconscious parenting is deeply grounded in millions of years of evolutionary programming. And that programming includes wanting the best for them, doing the most to ensure the best for them, wanting to prepare them to be as flexible, adaptable, as evolvable. I mean, that's what evolution is. It's adaptation to whatever life throws at us. And so parents do that both consciously and unconsciously. And what I mean by unconscious in this context, obviously, is not unthinkingly, but deeply genetically, like both grounded in our sociological programming, our cultural programming, but also in our genetic programming. How do mammals ensure the protection of their children? How do primates? How do hominins? And then how do we humans do so? And how has that shifted? So we're living in a time when things that for the last several hundred years we were able to take for granted, which, because of fossil fuel, because we got on sort of a bandwagon of progress, that a belief about progress, and human-centered progress, measurable human-centered progress, without factoring in what it was doing to the living world upon which we depended. There was a lot of regress going on there. But nonetheless, we deceived ourselves into thinking that you could have human progress in a world of ecological and climatological regress. We've had this belief that the future will have it better than us, that our kids will have it better than us, and that there's this sense of a future of more and more, greater and greater, bigger and bigger, easier and easier, wealthier and wealthier, and so on. And that didn't really exist in most agricultural societies prior to fossil fuels, because you knew from experience and stories of the past that you might not survive this coming winter if you got a bad winter, or if you didn't have a good harvest from the previous year. And so there was not that sense of inevitable onward, upward, bigger, better, easier until fossil fuels. And then with fossil fuels, we've started to have this technological progress, progress of knowledge, that is accumulation of more and more information and knowledge about how the world works and all that. But 300 years is long enough to ingrain some pretty deep expectations and habits of what should be, what ought to be, what is the natural state of things. Now we find ourselves in a world where those of us who have awakened to the reality of overshoot, of ecological overshoot, and as you know, because we've talked about this before, I considered William Catton's book, Overshoot, The Ecological Basis of Revolutionary Change, to be the single most important book I've ever read in my life. Not only did I read it, I recorded it, and I've read it again and listened to it about a dozen times because I recorded it, so I listen to it whenever I want. And I consider it scripture. I consider it probably the most inspired book I've ever read. In a world of overshoot and all of the various symptoms of overshoot, which include climate chaos as the biggest, baddest, meanest one, but overpopulation, species extinction, the growing gap between the rich and the poor, the acidification of the oceans, topsoil loss, the depletion of all minerals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all symptoms of overshoot. So in that kind of a world, we know from previous civilizations that became great and then overshot their carrying capacity and declined. We know that on the way down, expectations are dashed, and the sense of onward and upward isn't there anymore. The sense of that each generation is going to have it harder, more contracted, in some ways more difficult, but in some ways better, because there's a lot of decadence, there's a lot of unhealthiness at the peak of every civilization. Nonetheless, the most difficult, painful time, we know this from history, is when you're born into expanding opportunities, expanding economies, carrying capacity, that's the ecological term, carrying capacity, abundance of surplus, and then it shifts in your lifetime, and then it becomes carrying capacity deficit, and then you got to deal with that. People who have only known and die on the way up, progress is inevitable, it's inescapable, it's like, duh, I mean, it's a fact, at least human-centered progress. And if you are born and die in a time of contraction, regress is inevitable. It's a fact. Progress is a complete illusion. It's when you're born into times of expansion and then it shifts, and then you got to deal with the fact that your kids are going to have to deal and your grandkids are going to have to deal with contraction. That's the most emotional, difficult time. So your series here, talking to families and parents of how to do parenting in that context, is holy work. And so I'll say one more thing and then just shut up for a moment, which is that in the 1980s, when my kids were born, actually my daughter was born in 83, my son was born in 85, and my youngest daughter was born in 90. So during that period from 83 to 90, and then in through the 90s, Allison and I were very committed to having rituals and family meetings and practices and tools that we had learned from a variety of different sources, but ways to facilitate not just a sense of resilience and adaptation, so that whatever life would throw at any of our kids, we were confident, and we are confident, that they're going to be able to adapt and deal with it. That's perhaps the most important skill, is adaptability, resilience, flexibility of mind, heart, and body, strength of body as well. All my kids are athletic. Um, but also a sense of relational skill set, like how to be with others, how to listen deeply, heartfully, mindfully, soulfully to others, how to listen in a way that just the act of listening is transformative for the person you're listening to. That's a hell of a skill. That's a community building skill. That's a skill that we're going to have to rediscover, especially in a world where everybody's looking at their screens. How to hear feedback, and not just hear, how to invite radically honest feedback from others and not get defensive. That is a kick-ass skill. It's powerful. It's, and all on. So basically relational skills as well. How to be a part of a process where a group of people come to collective intelligence that exceeds the intelligence of any of them. These are just important skills. So we tried to instill those, create tools, context, friends, mentors, because we homeschooled for the first few years, of how to do that. And then in 2000, I got on sort of a techno-optimist bandwagon. I jumped onto this idea of techno-utopianism and a linear human understanding of progress. And so which really betrayed the ecological grounding that I had in Thomas Berry and Joanna Macy and so many others in the 1980s and 90s. And then I was sort of in a delusional place for 12 years until I got the urgency of climate in December of 2012, when I watched David Roberts' amazing TED Talk called Climate Change is Simple, the remix. There's a version without the remix, but the remix adds music and it's just very well done. So Climate Change is Simple, David Roberts, it's a remix. I think Ryan Cooper was the one that did it. And watching that on December 3rd of 2012 was life-changing. Connie and I sort of got kicked off the bandwagon of perpetual progress, of techno-utopianism. We got the urgency of climate. We got the folly of human-centeredness. And for the last 7 years, we've been studying passionately. I've been studying 20, 30, 40 hours, sometimes 50 hours a week, reading books, reading articles, recording them, posting them up on SoundCloud. Part of my legacy work is furthering the legacy of others who are in this field of deep sustainability, deep adaptation, climate chaos, contraction, civilizational collapse, all that kind of stuff. And so I'm back now to really, now that I got a 9-year-old granddaughter and I got another one coming, and I no longer held out hope that we can avoid many of the tipping points. So now I'm looking at how can I be of best service for as long as I get to live, as long as I'm graced to live. And one of them is having conversations like this. Like, what can I do to be of benefit to families, parents, and grandparents who are struggling with how to be with their grandchildren and their children in ways that prepare them for the inevitable challenges coming, that help them see that this is a time that in previous collapsing civilizations, that's when heroes are born, that's when sheroes are born, that's when saints and sages emerge. That's when greatness really emerges, because in difficult times, it's those that sacrifice for the well-being of the community and for the well-being of the future that are mythologized in the future, beyond that, And so it's not a time, in my experience, for woe is me, why the hell is this happening? What did we do to deserve this? All the moaning and griping. I mean, it's important to acknowledge that that's part of our psyche, and we typically go there because we baby boomers are the most spoiled narcissistic generation in human history. So it's not a surprise that we go immediately to there. But ultimately, it's a time of breathing deeply, learning some older spiritual practices, applying them now in new ways and in a new context. And as Jem Bendell states accurately, we are already in collapse. It's not a matter of will it happen, when will it happen. We've been 30, 40, 50, depending upon which metric you use, but we're decades into collapse, societal collapse, civilizational collapse. It happens in a contracting, John Michael Greer calls it the long descent. It's a stair step. That's the way of virtually every civilization that we've known in the past, and empire. And so that's the reality. We're looking at the strong likelihood, the almost impossible to ignore likelihood that it's going to be extremely painful and catastrophic. And human extinction in the next century, human extinction in the next 30 years can't be ruled out. categorically. It is very possible. So dealing with the inevitable collapse, in fact, it's already underway, dealing with the strong likelihood of catastrophe and really painful, difficult times, and dealing with the possibility of extinction. How do we be parents and grandparents in that process? So, all right, that's more than enough here at the start.
Yeah, well, thank you. That was quite a path that you laid out for us to follow. I wanted to stay with something that you mentioned a number of different times when you were speaking about using the historical context that we can bring forth from both history and science, and see what have the ups and downs of the past looked like in either great extinction events and their cycles, or the human ups and downs of various cultures. And I can appreciate what you're saying. I've read some similar tracks from both academics and other very well-informed authors about that kind of trajectory that we've found ourselves on from time to time, human beings, through various cultural iterations. The thing that I'm curious about, there are a couple of tracks I'd like to ask you about. One is, instead of what might be called a regular progression of the advance of a civilization, the evolution, the positive, progressive evolution of a prior civilization, and then when it hits its downside and heads on the downhill side of that curve. I'm familiar with that, and of course it makes sense, and people far brighter than me have articulated that trajectory for a number of times. What I keep seeing this time is there are elements that are happening so fast that it no longer looks to me like that kind of a gentle curve, either up or down. We've shot up so fast that the vast majority of our impact on ourselves and on Earth has rocketed in less than 100 years. We've done the vast majority of damage to ourselves and to our own habitat and to our beyond human neighbors. And the downhill slide looks to me like far less like a curve and far more like a cliff.
Yeah, let me actually touch on that, because I didn't spell that out. There's a thing, one of my dearest colleagues, Ugo Bardi, wrote a book called The Seneca Cliff. And he quotes Seneca, and that the way to greatness is slow and gradual, and the way to decline and collapse is swift. And there's that sense that it's not a bell curve; it's more like a rather steep rise. It's exponential, and then the cliff is usually twice as fast. So civilizations and empires typically take twice as long to become great as they do to collapse. In other words, they collapse twice as fast. And that tends to be a pattern that we see in many, both human and more than human systems, complex social structures, complex structures in nature. Yeah. So you're absolutely right. And depending upon where you draw the line, I mean, if you draw the line, say the last 10,000 years, then it looks damn near like a hockey stick. It's just, gradual, then whoa, with the 18th century, man, it's straight up practically. But if you start the graph, like say 250 years ago, then it looks not quite like that, but there's still this profound exponential that begins around 1940, 1950. And that exponential, while it's going up, it kind of ought to go down, because really what it means is a rapid a precipitous decline in the well-being of other species, of the climate and CO2, of the oceans and the fisheries. And, you can go down through all of the litany of ways that primary reality, the well-being of everything we depend upon, soil, forest, water, life, everything else, has been in precipitous decline now for 50 years. So yeah, that's really fast. And it's not likely to be, I mean, you and I both know, it could easily be that, especially if the abrupt climate change self-reinforcing tipping points like the Arctic feedback loops become so severe that methane is released and it makes it more severe. And, we could go extinct in 10 years. Anybody who thinks Guy McPherson is absolutely, completely dead wrong, and how could he say anything so foolish, hasn't been paying attention. Guy McPherson may be right. Most humans, if not all humans, may not exist by 2030.
Yeah.
But there's also a possibility that remnants of us will survive, not only for decades, but it's possible that remnants in pockets of the world could survive for another 2 or 3 million years before an asteroid or supervolcano takes us out. But that there will be a culling, a massive culling of the human population in the next 50 to 100 years that's likely to be well under 10% of what currently now exists, that seems a pretty much guaranteed thing in my world. And that's assuming that some of us survive the next 50 years.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you. That's consistent with why I was asking that question. So thank you. What I appreciate, Michael, is you speak with so many people, and you speak with so many people that I only get to speak with 2 or 3 folks that are quite a bit different than myself in a given year at any length. You speak with a broad range of people a lot every year. And I'm particularly thinking about people in the various faith communities you might speak with. And by my very primitive understanding is that there are a number of faith communities, Christian-based faith communities in particular in the USA, that are not taking kindly to this whole conversation just about climate change itself. Not anything about what you and I were just talking about at the extreme interpretation of the material, but just even thinking about it at the basic level. And I'm curious, could you give me a sense of the range? Where do people that you get to speak with in these various faith communities across the country, and folks that you just bump into as well, what are you seeing in terms of where are people positioning themselves with regard to what's really going on?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Well, anybody watching or listening to this who isn't familiar with my weird lifestyle and what Connie and I have been doing for 18 years, let me just say in a minute or two sort of background, because that will help create a context for my response to your question. So I was a minister, I was a pastor for 10 years, from the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s. And I then did environmental sustainability and community organizing work for 5 years. I helped neighbors come together and support each other in using less water, driving less, composting, recycling, all the different aspects of living a more earth-friendly, sort of carbon-lessened lifestyle, and building trust and community with their neighbors. So I did that for 5 years. And then for the last 18 years, Connie and I have traveled North America speaking close to 3,000 groups. I think we're 2,800 groups, literally everything from atheists to evangelicals. And we speak about where science, inspiration, and sustainability intersect. So virtually every Sunday, or at least many Sundays, not every Sunday, because the last several years we've been able to slow down a little bit. And so I may speak now 25 Sundays a year, whereas the first 8 or 9 years, it was like 48 or 50 Sundays a year. But also I do evening programs, middle of the week and stuff like that. And so I do get a chance. That old biblical phrase, to whom much is given, much is required, or much will be expected, comes to mind, because I feel graced to be regularly, like not day by day, week by week, year by year, in the context of lots of people who have values related to integrity and spirituality and generosity and things like that. Often spiritual people, but even when I'm speaking entirely to secular audiences, these are people who get science, who are committed to integrity no less than religious people. And who have a heart for what's coming down. You know, how did we get here, and what's unfolding now, and how do we be with ourselves and each other in the most fruitful ways, given what seems to be real and unfolding. And because I speak in very, very different religious settings, as well as lots of different secular settings, I've had the opportunity to hone my language. I did for almost 3 years. Connie and I, maybe more than 3 years, we gave out feedback forms, and we were asking people for their brutally honest, radically honest feedback. Like, what am I saying that's not working for you? What language is off-putting for the people who you value, and stuff like that. So now I know I can speak in virtually any kind of secular and religious setting, and about 90% of the people are going to really resonate with what I say. And as you know, my style is kind of a cross between Carl Sagan and a Pentecostal preacher, so I'm entertaining. Plus, we get to live in people's homes. And in people's homes, I'm not just interacting with folks as a speaker, as a leader. I'm interacting with as a man, as a person. And we share over breakfast, and we share over dinner, and we talk with each other about things that matter. And they open up to me because I'm a counselor and a therapist and a coach. And so I naturally have a way of being that invites people to be authentic and vulnerable. And I model that and freely share my struggles and challenges and various things, not just related to parenting, but I'm in recovery, addiction recovery, and so on. So we have heart-to-heart, deep conversations. And so I do feel privileged to have a window into a rather wide swath of at least Americans and Canadians, in terms of what matters and what matters most, and where they're struggling and where they're challenged. And then you mentioned my conversation series. That began in 2010, was the first one. I did the Advent of Evolutionary Christianity, where I interviewed 38 of the top leaders, literally the top Catholics, the top Protestants, the top evangelicals who fully embrace evolution and ecology, and interviewed them. And then that was made available. And then in 2014, did that one that you referred to, The Future is Calling Us to Greatness. And that was 56 of the world's top leaders around climate, deep sustainability, and a sprinkling of spiritual leaders that help us hold this scary stuff without just freaking out. And then now I'm doing the one that, in fact, that also includes you, which is the PostDoom Conversations. My postdoom.com is where people can learn about that. And that's for folks who are like us. That's for folks who are very much in this community of souls, let's put it that way, secular and religious, who get climate change, who get abrupt climate change in most cases, who get resource depletion and all the other big challenges that are symptoms of overshoot, who've moved through whatever grief and despair and anger and depression they need to move through, not to say we don't sometimes cycle back, and then come out the other side, what Paul Chafurka calls finding the gift. On the other side of acceptance, there can be that place of, oh my God, what a gift of grace, natural grace, inevitable grace, the grace of the living world, to be alive at this time, to be conscious of this time, to feel the grief of other species, to feel the loss, and then ultimately to be a blessing, to be of service to our communities and our friends and neighbors and what have you. And so, yeah, I keep waking up each day trying to be faithful, trying to be in integrity with what life, and I use the word God and life interchangeably. For me, God is a mythic name for life, or for reality with a personality, you could say. And life, or reality, is sort of a secular name for ultimacy. And so for me, I try to wake up each day being faithful to life and to do what I can do to make a difference where I can make a difference. And now, in the last several years, especially, I'm solidly in the camp of where Jem Bendell and Catherine Ingram and Dar Jamel and Barbara Cecil and so many others, you and Carolyn Baker and Guy McPherson. I mean, I invited Guy to be part of my series, and he didn't want to because he had been, he felt some bad blood between him and others in the series. But in any event, those who get the big challenges, who get that extinction is quite possible, um, and yet have to wake up each day finding something meaningful to do. And there's just, frankly, no shortage of deeply meaningful, soul-nourishing work. So that's why, as you know, I define doom as that emotional midpoint between denial and regeneration. When I speak in Christian churches, I say between denial and resurrection, because that's what resurrection is. It's not merely about some God man 2,000 years ago. It's about regeneration. It's about the nature of nature. This is the way the world works. And life will regenerate with or without us. Whether we go extinct in the near term or not, life will regenerate. So I see doom as that emotional midplace between denial and regeneration. And post-doom as that space that opens up, that heart place that opens up when we basically, when we remember who we are, that we are part of the universe, we're part of nature. So when we remember who we are, when we accept what is inevitable, honor our grief, and then invest in what is pro-future and soul nourishing. And that's, of course, what your work has been so central to, your conversations and your writings and everything else. And this series, in terms of how to apply that and how to draw out the wisdom from parents, I think is the next major step in this movement.
Well, thank you. And specifically, I'm just going to share with you a real stuck place in myself where I just bumped my forehead against this for years now. And I just don't understand. And this is not for lack of trying, and I promise I will keep trying, there are certain aspects, particularly of the evangelical community in the USA, that I'm very pleased to tell you that I read an article this morning that I have yet to fully finish, and I promised to dive in deep to it because it was the first article I had read about significant movement forward, in my judgment, in the evangelical community. This was written and an interview with a person who has been actively trying to bring these sober conversations about what's going on in the world, and particularly about the environment and climate and so on, and that they're making extraordinary headway. So first, I'll just say that I'm excited about that article. It's one of the first things that's really given me hope for bridging and understanding and connecting with the evangelical community in where I live and so on. I'm so curious, can you describe any portion of the more resistant evangelical community or any other aspect of the faith community that has that kind of what seems to be a firm grip on an unwillingness to let go for many folks of, this is how life is, we interpret it this way, it does not include anything about climate change or that humans can be doing this, so there's an unwillingness to engage in the conversation at all. Can you help me untangle that a little bit?
I would be honored to at least try. First of all, I was an evangelical. I was a Pentecostal. I went to an Assemblies of God college. It still shows up in my expressiveness and in my exuberance, and I still speak in tongues. For me, it's nothing supernatural. It's like gobbledygook, I can do that, and I can do it internally, and it's a way of silencing the meaning-making, verbal, rational part of my brain. So I stay in the present moment, because while I'm thinking in tongues, I am not thinking about the past, not thinking about the future. I'm like right here, right now. kind of like listening to a concert or a symphony. It's like you're just in the present moment because you're noticing, not thinking. So I still have a deep appreciation for the evangelical and Pentecostal world. So I still have an appreciation, a deep appreciation for much of my evangelical heritage, because when I had a born again experience in 1988, when I had a born again experience in 1979, from then until like 1988, I was very much immersed in a Pentecostal, charismatic, evangelical worldview. And I consider myself a Pentecostal naturalist, an evangelical naturalist, meaning I have no supernatural or otherworldly beliefs at all. I interpret all mythic language as saying something metaphoric or poetic or symbolic about the nature of reality and our relationship to it, this one reality that we live and move and have our being within. I also, because I used to be an evangelical Christian who interpreted the Bible literally, and I read the Bible twice, I know that worldview quite well, and I can build a bridge to many evangelicals and Pentecostals and help invite them, sometimes very successfully, into an ecological evolutionary worldview. I also, in the last 7 years, as I think you know, have been studying the rise and fall of civilizations. And I would say, if someone were to ask me, what has been your major study or interest in the last, say, 4 decades, I would probably say worldviews. I'm most interested and have been a passionate student and independent scholar in the field of worldviews. How do people structure in language, philosophy of language is my favorite course in all my graduate and undergraduate work. How do people structure in language their relationship to reality? How do they think about it? How do they interpret it? How do those interpretations lead them to live their lives? What kind of communities are formed around these interpretive language games, is the way that Wittgenstein was talking about it, or paradigms, the way Thomas Kuhn would talk about it. How does that happen? And so, understanding that, I realized that, oh gosh, okay, in previous contracting civilizations, those that didn't collapse because of a war or because of, say, a volcano erupted in their region or whatever, but those that contracted and collapsed because of resource depletion and wiping out the forests or the soil or whatever, or social dysfunction because of the hierarchy that often, usually, almost always comes with state power. On the way down, people have worldviews that had given their lives meaning on the way up, and they don't let go of those. The two most common delusions that people have in times of contraction and collapse are those who continue to espouse the belief, and it's more than a belief for them, that's the lenses, that's their paradigm, it's just their truth of perpetual progress. So they look at collapse, but they don't see it. They look at contraction, but they can't see it. They're blind to it because they have expectations of ongoing improvement. So if there's 1,000 things to pay attention to, and 200 of them are improvements of something at some scale, and 800 of them are collapsing, they won't see the 800. All they can see is the 200. And so you're never going to stop that. That's going to continue. And that's going to continue now. In the next 20, or let's 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years, however long we have, and even if it's hundreds of years or even a few thousand years, whatever, well, if it goes that far, I mean, anything beyond 100 years from now, people won't be able to maintain that denial. But assuming, that it happens faster than that, you're not going to change fundamentalists. You're not going to change worldviews of any, and fundamentalists. Steven Pinker is a fundamentalist. Steven Pinker is a well-known atheist, but he is profoundly committed to a secular religious worldview. His religion is the worldview of perpetual progress, and he can't see anything else. And he shouldn't be faulted for not being able to see anything else. That's the thing. People who have that worldview are going to have that. And it turns out that in collapsing civilizations, most people go to their grave in denial. They never get it. They never accept the truth, as the progressives or the liberals or the collapsitarians or the doomers get. They don't ever get it. And so trying to convince those people or convert those people is fruitless. Go ahead if you want to, but it's not going to happen. You're not going to shift people out of their religious worldview. If you believe that Jesus is coming back, like in the next decade or two, and what you mean by that isn't what I mean by it, which is a completely naturalistic reinterpretation, but you mean some supernatural being is coming down in the clouds, and you interpret biblical prophecy literally, you're not going to convince those people. So if those people are in your families, friends, neighbors, just bless them, love them exactly as they are and exactly as they're not, and stop trying to convert them. It would be my coaching.
Yeah.
So I'll just stop there because, well, one other thing, which is that there's another, okay, so you've got those who believe that it's the contraction isn't real, collapse isn't real. And I got lots of friends and some family in that world. You've also got those who believe if we all just ... meaning if we all just think a certain way, feel a certain way, vote a certain way, if we all just whatever transformation of consciousness they think will make the difference, then ... all these good things will happen. And that also never happens. It's never happened in the history of human race. So my advice to anybody is to just love and cherish the people in your life who are the perpetual progress folk. Love and cherish those who believe that, you know, and who are fighting for, you know, if we all just this or whatever, just accept them as they are. Don't try to show that you're right. Don't try, and be curious, because both of those groups may have something of value for you and wherever you are. But ultimately, find your tribe. Find the people who get collapse, who get contraction, who get overshoot, who get abrupt climate change, which is climate change happening in one human lifetime that used to take 1,000 to 10,000 years. Find people like that and communicate with them. Be involved in the Positive Deep Adaptation Forum. Be involved in the Deep Adaptation Forum. But this is the tribe of folks, and don't do it righteously. And the best thing to do when you're with your neighbors, just accept their worldview. Find ways of translating what they say that it makes sense so that you make the translation. I mean, I can go in lots of different religious settings, worship settings, Buddhist settings, Native American settings, Christian settings of all different kinds, Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, what have you, Pentecostal. And I know how to translate. I know how to interpret their mythic language, even if they're interpreting it literally, whatever. I don't interpret literally. I make it mean something to me. And that way I've got a really good relationship with a lot of different people with a lot of different worldviews. And they don't experience me as a arrogant prick because I've got some righteous right position that I'm trying to convince them of.
You know, I'm just going to pause for a moment because you've just covered extraordinary ground. I know that you and I have had this type of conversation a number of times, but I guess I'll just speak for myself. There's this hope, this very, if I can judge myself for a moment, this very naive hope that I have carried, you know, really since day one. And this, even through the thick and thin of researching and writing my own book about this and compiling this body of work, I still have this naive hope that there's some way to connect with people so very, very different than me. If only, as you said, ... And there's something both deeply disturbing for me and deeply relieving for me in you mapping out the territory that you've covered quite a bit in your life. You know of what you speak. You've spoken with a lot of people in exactly the kinds of positions on the human field that you've been talking about.
Yeah, if I could just jump in real quick.
Yeah.
First of all, I appreciate the heart and the humility with which you're speaking right now. And I don't want to give the wrong impression, because it is possible to shift certain people's thinking and feeling. It is possible to influence people's worldviews. It is possible to offer someone a new vision of what could be, how they could think, how they might interpret, that is so alluring to them, because you're not making wrong how they are thinking, how they are feeling, and how they are interpreting, that they just like, kind of like, duh, they're going to step into that because it's a bigger, broader, more inclusive context. So I'm not meaning to suggest that you should never share what you know, think, feel, envision, how you interpret, in ways that are profoundly soul nourishing to you, because you see this other person suffering, or you see this other person being an asshole or whatever, and you realize, or you think, that if they had this piece that you are carrying in your heart or mind, it could make a difference for them. So out of compassion, out of generosity, and out of relationship, you want the best relationship with these people you want. I'm assuming this isn't just strangers. These are people in your life, in your neighborhood, or whatever. And you can. And I've had many, countless, not countless, but hundreds of examples of people who have been very conservative in their particular religious interpretation, their doctrine, their dogma, their worldview, and in a respectful conversation where I'm in no way assuming or communicating verbally or non-verbally that mine is a better interpretation, that I'm right or whatever. So there's no part of them that's going into defensive mode, because that's what we do. When our worldviews are challenged, we defend that sucker for good evolutionary reasons. So they don't do that because we're just sharing from the heart. And I've worked for many years to be able to do that in ways that don't come off as arrogant and self-righteous and whatever, and know-it-all, because that's my nature. I can easily go to the place of arrogance and self-righteousness and know-it-all. So it's taken some spiritual practice to get to be able to communicate where that's not the case most of the time. So for example, I did a program. I was invited to do 2 TEDx talks both in Grand Rapids, Michigan, very conservative parts of the world. And the first one was on evolutionary psychology and brain science. And I spoke about our evolved nature and our mismatched instincts, and how our instincts evolved for millions of years to serve us in the kind of world that all animals and sustainable humans have lived. But our instincts are profoundly problematic when we are in unsustainable, self-destructive cultures. And the more, last 7, 8, 10,000 years, the more and more our mismatched our instincts are, to where now, our instincts cause lots and lots of problems. So anyway, so I talked about all this in my 20-minute TED Talk. And that evening, I had 3 evangelicals come up to me completely independently, like over a period of about an hour and a half. Each of them came up to me independently, and they all said roughly the same thing, which was, I was a young earth creationist until I heard your talk. Now I've got to accept evolution. I just got to do it in a God-honoring way. And one young man, he was in his mid-20s, I'm guessing, he said, I always thought that evolution was about Darwin, DNA, and dinosaurs. I didn't know it was about how to have a more Christ-like life and have healthier relationships. And that's the practical side of an evolutionary worldview. And because I was communicating simply, here's how I interpret, and it lights me up. It gives me so much joy. I mean, my life is so richer and more full and more meaningful, and I'm able to be more generous and kind and less judgmental and less arrogant and less fearful with this Christian naturalist interpretation, this sacred realism or religious naturalism, by simply sharing my enthusiasm, but not in a way that I'm right, you're wrong. It's just like, hey, wow, this really works for me. I allow people, and sometimes people can step into a different way of interpreting their own faith. But I'm under no illusions that this is going to happen for millions of people. This is going to happen for individuals and occasionally subsets of people who come to my programs, but it's not going to happen on any large scale.
I love how this conversation has gone so very, very differently than virtually every other conversation in this series. And I guess I should have expected it from you, Michael. It's so wonderful to be able to follow you down these trails, these paths that you've walked that so very few people that I've ever known have walked. It's important territory that you're showing me and us, because I just don't know. I just freaking don't know. And it's been so deeply frustrating for me to try and figure it out with no contact, with no way to kind of get a reality check from time to time from these people that I feel so different from, so distant from, because I have so little contact. So it's a rich experiential base that you share from, and I'm just finding myself appreciating it. And I've jotted down a few other questions and directions I would like to have gone, and perhaps at some later time we can follow
Yeah,
that.
I'm happy to have another conversation with you, either on or offline, because I love you and I respect you and I love talking about this stuff.
Yeah, I can feel this envelope of our conversation drawing to a close, and I just really am inclined again to just slow down, give some space between words here. I'm letting your sharing sink in, as a powerful first delivery of a few minutes ago, and then slightly adjusting it after you heard my reaction. And both very important pieces. I really want you to know I'm going to sit with this for a while, and I'm holding precious this conversation. It's been so important.
Well, can I share just a quick little story? Maybe take a minute or two.
Of course you can.
Well, because where we stayed just prior to seeing you, just before we drove up and saw you in Medford, the day before or 2 days before, we were in Eureka, California. And one of our neighbors is a fundamentalist, very, very conservative, biblical literalist, fundamentalist woman who's 77 years old. And Connie and I just love her, and she loves us. And she believed that the second coming of Christ was going to literally happen like the day or two, like probably the day that we saw each other. I mean, she's got this whole biblical thing and everything else. And we just have such a loving relationship that I don't challenge her interpretations. And I say, well, I kind of hope you're wrong, because I'd love to see you when we're back here in March. And we laugh. And then I'd say, but if the rapture happens, here's the thing. Would you be willing to sign a note to your family? Because she's got like dozens and dozens of the greatest movies in these albums. I said, I'd love your album set, because I probably won't be caught up with you, because I don't believe like you. We have this playful, goofy, but really loving sense. And that's what I hope for all of us who are in this conversation, people who are like yours and my tribe, that they can so accept the worldview of their more conservative and people who don't get climate the way we do, and don't get collapse the way we do, and don't have the religious worldview that we do, that you just love and accept people exactly as they are and exactly as they're not, but also be able to poke fun at yourself. And so that what they relate to is the heart, the generosity, the love, the relationship, and we don't stumble over the beliefs, because it wasn't that long ago that we humans didn't have words, and we related like every other animal, non-verbally, with gestures and tones and touch and all that stuff. And I think that's the stuff that matters, is the stuff about deep relationship. So again, your parenting thing, the most important thing we can do with parents is hold our kids, caress our kids, be there, weep with our children, and then share with them that this is a time for greatness. This is a time that gives birth. These challenging times are what give birth to heroes, sheroes, saints, and sages. And that if they know that their life is going to be however long or short, even though they might die sooner than, say, their grandparents did, because times are tough and chaos is real, that nonetheless they have opportunities to contribute to their communities in truly self-sacrificial, heroic ways. And so then they are not freaked out by the challenges. They see it as an opportunity to be, in my worldview, Christian, Christ-like, pro-future. It's not about believing anything. It's being pro-future. It's being pro-community in a sacrificial way. So anyway, I look forward to watching all of these interviews that you're doing in this series.
Oh, Michael, you've outdone yourself. I am so moved, and I look forward to watching this again and again, and letting the layers sink in. Thank you so much for participating in this parenting oriented series, and I so look forward to almost in the same breath watching and keeping track of your summit, the incredible series of interviews that you're in the middle of producing. I'm so glad that we get to be co-travelers on this path, and I so respect and appreciate the many gifts you bring. And again, this time, like, really far beyond any of the earlier conversations we've had and interviews we've done. Particularly moved this time, and I thank you, brother. Thank you so much for bringing yourself and bringing your heart so fully this time.
Thank you. And I wish I could reach through the screen and take your hand, because the title of this thing, Take My Hand, that's what I want to do. And that's what we are doing, is we're taking each other's hands. So thanks, brother.
There we go.
Love you, man. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Please send my best to Connie, and I look forward to the next time we get the chance to be together.
Great. I do too.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net.
Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.